Afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this seminar. I hope you find it interesting. I hope you find it useful. As Yelena has mentioned, I am the research director in the School of Education at Ulster University, so I have a particular responsibility for developing and progressing the research profile of our work as educationalists in the school. And part of what I wanted to focus on today was how we can perhaps begin to consider how we can share good practice in terms of developing the reach and the impact of the research that we undertake. Because good teaching is very often and most often underpinned by good research, and the two coexist in a very harmonious relationship. So research is very important within our work as educationalists, but it's also important that we get that research out into a wider sphere and that we use that research to progress our knowledge or understanding of educational issues. And that's what we're going to look at today. And what I sometimes say to people whenever we're thinking about and planning to develop a kind of a reach or an impact in our research, it's about taking all of those diverse component parts of your work and thinking, how can I organize them into something that's actually quite unique and quite special, into something that has value and that makes a contribution, not just within your own institution or within your own schools, but on a wider national and international platform. And we're going to look at that in a little bit more detail as we go through the presentation. So before we begin to look at how we can develop our research, I would like to take a bit of a step back and remind ourselves what we broadly consider research to be. And for some people, particularly those colleagues who are perhaps at different stages or different phases of their teaching and their research career, it is a question that can draw a range of responses, such as, well, research is about collecting data, it's about analysing trends, it's about conceptualising ideas or advancing our understanding of a particular issue. It could also be about discovering new knowledge or challenging perhaps existing knowledge, taking our research and applying it into real life settings, or else generating new research settings in which to undertake the research. And research undoubtedly involves combinations of all of those at different points in times. However, it is important, I think, for us that we take all of these ideas and we try to distill them into a much more collective, more accessible interpretation that removes the kind of the abstract understandings of research and positions it much more in terms of its holistic contribution and how that can be used to advance our knowledge and understanding of education. So if we just take it back in a very holistic, very humanistic interpretation, research can be defined as the good that researchers do in the world, whether that's a perceived good or a demonstrable good, but that it brings about some kind of benefit, whether that's to individuals, to groups, to organisations, and to society. And in wanting to think about our research and our research activity, we do have to ask ourselves, who are the researchers in our institutions? Who are the researchers that we work with? And in every institution, researchers are undoubtedly a vital population in progressing both the reach and the impact of research in their chosen area. So researchers undoubtedly are all of us here today who are interested in and curious about the educational environments that we work in and the wider contexts and policies that can impact on the structure and the provision of education in our chosen areas. And as researchers, or as a research population, we are all very representative of a range of, we're all representative of colleagues, I suppose, across a range of ages, across a range of stages of career. And that can be from the young person, the young colleague who has progressed in a very linear way from their undergraduate studies to masters to PhD, perhaps to a practitioner and a professional who maybe picked up the research mantle at a much later point in life or in their career. So it is a very broad continuum. However, I think it is important that we acknowledge that every researcher brings with them a knowledge, a skill set, an expertise, an insight, and an experience that can be very productively and positively channeled to extend the impact of their research and the contribution that it might make. And so researchers therefore have a very integral role in supporting colleagues, their other colleagues, to achieve that, those colleagues who might not yet be on the research path, whether that's through mentoring, through collaboration with those colleagues, through signposting options by which they might be able to access research opportunities or ways that they might be able to promote and advance their own research profile. So one of the things that we're going to think about as we get into the body of the presentation today is to take some time to consider this word reach and to consider what it is, why it matters, and how you as researchers can achieve it both in the short and in the longer term. Now, the suggestions that I'm sharing today, it is not an exhaustive list, but rather I'd see them as a starting point. And some of these you might already be undertaking. Others are perhaps options that you might want to consider as you progress through your research. They're all valid. They all have a role and a contribution to make in terms of advancing your research. But I think it's important that if we harness them in a kind of a collective package, that you can begin to see the various options that might exist. So broadly, we can describe reach in research as the extent and the diversity of the communities, the environments, the organisations, the individuals, or any other benefactor or beneficiary that might either benefit from or be impacted by your research. In other words, what you have uncovered, what you have found out, what you have concluded in your research is going to have make some kind of contribution or have some kind of impact on how education provision is provided. So if we break that definition down a little bit further, there are a few quite basic benchmarks that can distill the core components of research or a reach in your research and provide a foundation through which you can begin to develop it or progress it. And these include, for example, if you're seeking to develop reach in your research, well, you think, well, how can I make sure that I reach more people in terms of the audience that I want to access my research, whether that's individuals or whether that's a broader audience, or whether it's specific groups of people. You want to think about, well, how can I make the accessibility, how can I improve the accessibility of my research to make it easier for, let's say, somebody who's reading about it to access my research, that it's not hidden away on some repository, or it's not naturally or easily found, so that people can actually have access to it. And then also, how can I affect impact in terms of, sorry, I've moved that along a wee bit. How can I affect what kind of effect and influence can I bring to my research in terms of how can the activity that I'm undertaking, how can I package that in a way that makes the findings easier to understand, easier to disseminate, so that it can reach as broad and as wide an audience as possible, so it doesn't become inaccessible. And with that then, as we're thinking, well, that's the purposes That's the purposes of are the rationale behind wanting to develop reach in your research. It also then helps you ask yourself three very fundamental questions, which is first of all, well, who actually is going to be interested in my research? If I know that, what people or what groups, what individuals has the influence that will allow me to make sure that my research has reach, and then also thinking who is going to be impacted by my research, and that will also help me decide that. So it's worth noting that at this point that this notion, this concept of reach, and it's also to do with impact, which we'll come to later on, is something that you want to consider factoring in or building into your research planning from the very beginning, from the very outset. And that even includes the planning phase when you're thinking about a research idea or you're thinking about developing a research proposal or a research project. You have to think about these questions even at that point, because that's going to help shape and going to help define your research and how you undertake it and how you disseminate it. So if we think back to the previous slide then, you're thinking, well, who exactly is my audience going to be? And part of that question to yourself is, who do you want the research to have an impact with, and what is it, what issues is it that they care about? So you need to think about things like that in terms of your audience. In terms of how I communicate and engage people with my research, you might want to ask yourself, well, how can I involve my audience in the research? How will I communicate with them during the time of the project? And how will I promote or share the results with them as part of this kind of reach and dissemination strategy? And then another fundamental question is just about time. Do you have enough time to dedicate to ensure that your research gets the reach and the impact that you want it to achieve? So have you factored in a certain amount of time planning within your overall research activity? Now, while sometimes undertaking this bit of pre-planning or thinking can be dismissed or viewed as time consuming or just not worth the hassle, it is undoubtedly time that is well invested, because what it does is it encourages you to see your research beyond its purely academic sphere and to very much locate it in the social world, whether that's with other professionals, whether it's with practitioners, whether it's with the general public, or with researchers outside your discipline. It could be with public interest groups, NGOs, policymakers, funders, and so on. But all of those disparate groups, there are some common needs that they will have, but they will also have some quite particular needs. And that's why you do have to think about, who is my main audience? How will I communicate with them? And how can I ensure that I have the time to engage? So it is always time well invested and time well spent. And that's why things like that are very much important as part of the planning process. Another consideration is thinking, well, I do want to take my research out into that wider social world that we mentioned in the last slide. And the transfer of your research from quite a small, insular, sometimes academic world into the social world is pivotal in developing, growing, and sustaining the reach and the impact of your research. So, for example, there was a recent study undertaken, I think it was in one of the Nordic countries, and the researchers there found out that are really stressed the importance of engagement with target audiences. And they reported that that was highlighted again and again with the interviewees that they talked to, all from very, very different disciplines. So whether they were talking to interviewees about securing funding to start up a project, or interviewees who were wanting to deliver health messages to children or education messages to teachers, The message was was very clear and very consistent. You really, really need to thoroughly understand your intended audience and their needs in order to carry out meaningful research that will have an impact on them and on their outcomes. So again, I don't think it's something that can be rushed or that should be undersold in any way. Excuse me. So the whole notion of that importance of engagement and communication is pivotal and are synonymous in developing reach and impact on your research. So from the very outset, as researchers, we should be planning and indeed preparing to um, clearly map out how I'm going to communicate and engage with audiences throughout the research process. And as I said before, that's including and before the research even starts. So how do I do some of the groundwork? How can I do some of that preparatory work that gives people an indication of the research that you're going to conduct, how you're going to conduct it, how they might be involved in the research, maybe allaying any concerns or any questions that the intended audiences might be, because that kind of almost creates a clear pathway that allows the research then to take place in an unhindered kind of way. Because sometimes we have found, perhaps when here in Northern Ireland, just as a way of an example, we sometimes have undertaken research where we go to talk to schools or talk to parents about education provision in a given area. And for example, you might know that education provision in Northern Ireland is very segregated. So therefore, it's quite a controversial and quite a sensitive issue. And if we walked into a local community and started asking parents and teachers about education provision, they would understandably get quite nervous, perhaps be quite suspicious of what we were doing, and maybe very unwilling to talk about it. Whereas if we took some time before the research began to go down into that area or to those schools, explain the whole purpose of the research, provide transparency as much as possible, um, and allay or answer any queries that parents or teachers or the local community might have. You've done a lot to preparing a nice even ground before you go in, so that reticence and that suspicion has actually probably been removed or certainly substantially reduced, and you have a better chance of actually undertaking meaningful research and having meaningful data at the back of that. And that would go, I think, for anything like that where the research that you're doing is likely to perhaps make people a little bit wary or a little bit nervous. So that whole notion of communication and engagement, as I say, is pivotal. It's also important that how you communicate to your audience and how you interpret the results is done in a way that is accessible to the audience that you want to reach. We all know, and I mean, I am guilty of this, is if you get a very, very academic report, if you get a very technical report, you look at the first page or you look at the executive summary and you think, I do not need to read any more. It is just in language that means nothing to me. There is a place for academic reports, there is a place for technical reports, but if you're tapering your research, say, I want to get this out into the public sphere, or I want to make this attractive to policymakers or to school principals or to teachers, you have to package it, you have to give a version of it that is articulated and that is expressed in a language that will be accessible to them, that will make them want to read more, that will engage them, and that will not alienate them from what the research is, because it just automatically switches people off to it. It's also important that you think about, well, that wider networking in terms of how can I expand the reach of my research, in terms of how do I navigate the communications that I might have, perhaps with schools, with policymakers, even with the media and with that wider general public whom you think might be of interest to your research. So with that in mind, thinking about, well, how do I get my research out there? How do I get it in user-friendly ways and in accessible ways that's actually going to make people want to engage and be really interested in the research that I am doing? So what we're going to look at now is just some of the most instant and achievable ways of developing the reach and the impact of your research. And then we'll look at, in the subsequent slides, we'll look at some other options as well. So first of all, if it is possible and if it is feasible within your own education context, the simple act of uploading your research to your institutional or your school repository will very, very quickly make it visible and accessible to reach a wider audience. And you would be surprised at the number of people who don't do this. They just assume, oh, sure, my research is finished. That's me. I'm all done. But it's a thing that is easy to complete, but quite often overlooked. So that's something that definitely is an immediate hit. Adding also, if again, if it's feasible, if your institution has a website where you have your name, your contact details, and all your basically your academic profile, adding your most recent research to your institutional repository and your, sorry, I'll stick to the repository at the minute. Adding the research to that institutional repository option includes access, for example, within your own institution as well as with other institutions, to researchers who maybe don't have access to, for example, certain peer-reviewed journals where there's perhaps a fee attached to being able to access it. So this is a kind of a form of open access, I guess, that allows other people to see what you've done and to read your research. It also means by having it uploaded in this way, your research can be found very easily via a range of search engines. For example, whether that's a specialized scholarly search engine or whether it's something just as straightforward as Google Scholar, it will still show up. So again, you're putting your research out there. Similarly, your research can benefit from creating an URL, creating a hyperlink for that research, which also gives any user immediate access to your work. And that also means make sure that it's also available to the wider public as well. Secondly, then, uploading your published research to your own institutional repository should automatically add that to your staff profile, to your individual staff profile. So your staff profile or your academic footprint, if you like, they are great ways and very easy ways of signposting the range of research outputs that you have, as well as signposting to outsiders what your research expertise is in. And again, sometimes people overlook the value of that. And that provides a way of signposting not just perhaps a completed research report, it could be completed journal articles, it could be conference presentations, project web pages, and any kind of social media or wider media coverage. So it's a great way by adding that to your academic footprint of automatically creating that expanse and that reach in your research. In the same way then, reach and impact can be achieved just by simply adding a new research output to your email signature, just at the bottom of your emails. Again, it's a very quick and it's a very easy win. And if you think of the number of emails that you send to different people over the course of a day, each of those recipients of your email is potentially a new set of eyes for your research. And in turns, they could share that link to your research with someone else. So that's again another quick hit to have. Another way, again, through your institution or your school or college, is to share your research on social media. So, for example, if you are on social media in a professional capacity, you do have that ready-made platform that allows you to share your research. So, for example, if you're on Twitter, which is now X, I guess, or Blue Sky, you can pin your tweet so that it stays at the top of your profile and is much more prominent. So if anybody Googles you or searches for you, they will see the most immediate research that you've done. And if you don't have that personal account, it's likely perhaps that your school or your faculty or your institution might have one. So you could ask them, could they share your research through that particular link? We've also talked in the past about the value of platforms such as LinkedIn. Now, although LinkedIn tends to be a business to business platform, you can still share your research activity on that platform, particularly if you have a version that's in a much more accessible format, or if you can provide a summary on it of it in your status update. Um, so things like that are very, very good at promoting your research and beginning to generate um, that research. And you can do it in multiple ways using multiple methods, and that automatically capitalizes on the relevance of your research. And that's where social media also has a very good role to play. So, for example, say something has happened, an educational decision has happened in the policy sphere, or say there is a news item that perhaps aligns with what your research is about. You can kind of tag your research onto that by saying, I see that the Ministry of Education or the Department of Education has been talking about school sustainability. Readers might be interested to know we are currently doing a particular piece of research on the issue of dot dot dot. And it allows you again to align your research with something that's very current and very relevant within that day. There might be, for example, a World Awareness Day on something, a National Awareness Day on a particular topic that relates to your research. And all of those are opportunities allowing you to link your research to something else. So if we think then about maximising how we can begin to further then, if we've begun to take those baby steps of maximising the reach and the impact of our research, there's other ways that we can continue to do that, and they become quite intuitive, and they do become more fluent as we develop our research profile. So maximising the reach of our research can invariably will involve a significant amount of communication and networking with those outside of the academic sphere. And we've talked about how important that social world is. So as you begin to widen the pool of possible reach for your research, there's some other relatively quick and easy options that can be considered in terms of sharing your research. First of all, something as straightforward as distributing it to a mailing list. So, for example, if you were a member of an association, or you're a member of an organisation or a group that has a mailing list, you could share your research output with the group, asking them to distribute it to their members. And if you're doing that, it's always helpful to give a reason as to why members might benefit from reading your research. So, for example, you might say last month somebody raised a question about school school uniforms, let's say. My research looks at this, has been looking at this particular issue, and your members might be interested in finding out a little more about it. Or you might have said, I've recently had a paper, let's say the topic is on special educational needs. You might say, I've recently had a paper on this topic published, and you and your members might find it useful. Here's a link if you would like to read it. And if anyone would like to come and talk to me about it, you can provide your email address. So that can be done quite quickly and quite neatly. You might also want to identify a specific audience, or a specific target audience in terms of who do I want to share this with, who in turn will share it more widely. So, for example, in a situation like that, you might think of who would be, if I had to identify 5 people who would like to read my research, who might be interested in it, and ask yourself, why have I picked that person? Why might why might they be interested in reading it? So just think about who that audience might be. So that might be someone that you met at a conference. It might be someone that you saw at a conference who was given a paper on a topic similar to yours. It might be a colleague from another institution that you think, well, I might maybe want to develop a kind of a collaborative working relationship with that purpose or with that individual. Anything like that at all are possibilities to identify a specific audience who might be interested in reading your research. And by getting in touch with them, you can explain why you're contacting them, and just explain why you've got in touch with them. And that kind of in itself creates a very virtuous, reciprocal academic or professional relationship that really builds on the relationships that you have, but that then slowly but surely begins to broaden and widen that out. In terms of your own research, you might decide it's timely and it's relevant to generate your own media coverage. So, for example, a lot of institutions will have their own internal media platform and their own internal press office. So you might get in touch with them and ask them to share your work both to the internal audience of your institution as well as the outward facing platform so that external audiences can also see it. And if your research, for example, is touching on a topical issue or provides a fresh insight into a particular issue, that can give it greater press visibility. And press offices, both in institutions and within the wider media, will typically hold people's contact details, and you may be invited perhaps to speak on a local radio or on local television or to local newspapers, that you can provide that trusted and that expert opinion on this particular topic. And that would tend to happen here in Northern Ireland, where the university has its own press office, and the media, the external media, would reach out to researchers and to academics through the press office in terms of, we would like you to talk for 5 minutes on the research that you've completed recently. So again, it feeds that kind of reciprocal relationship. Another very easy and very important way of maximising the reach of your research is simply translating it into a different format. So you can make your research much more accessible by sharing it in different formats and via different platforms. And this is a really important alternative option, since, as I've already said, we know that not everybody wants to read an academic paper or a very lengthy report. However, your research still does have very important messages that you want to share with a wider audience. So how can you maximise that and generate that research in what we think of as maybe bite-sized, but nonetheless very accessible and informative pieces of information that don't lose the overall importance of what you have to say? Well, some ways of doing that are, again, you've probably done some of these, as a blog post. So we know that a blog post is a much, much shorter document and much more accessible than a journal article or a report. They're very easy to write, very easy to share, and they can include links to other relevant research publications and websites should anybody want to read more about it. We sometimes have what we would call practitioner reports or executive summaries or just briefing papers, which are usually no more than 2 or 3 pages long. And these distill all the key points into a very accessible format with that audience in mind. And the key of having a successful shorter report, if you like, executive summary, briefing paper, is that they're free of academic jargon, but still get the importance of what you're doing about. There's also the chance to use things like visual summaries or infographics. They have even less text again, and are a very another engaging way of getting practitioners, policymakers, or other third parties to read about your research, particularly for those people that are very short in time and they want to just be able to look at something very quickly and get the key headline, top line points across. There's also things like podcasts or short videos. They're an increasingly popular way to access content. Videos, for example, or podcasts can be developed within your own institution or with an outside agency, depending on what is accessible. But again, if there are options to do that and you feel you could reach an audience that way, then it's definitely something to be explored. And then finally, just thinking about how can I'm going to a particular event, a particular conference, how can I share my research there and maximize on the audiences that are there? So if, for example, the findings of your research are useful to a particular group or to a particular organization or to a particular region, are there any events there that you could present at? For example, within the policy sphere, is there the opportunity to present to some of the working groups or departmental groups within your ministry or your government? Are there any statutory, non-statutory, or voluntary agencies who run regular seminars that you could come along and contribute with? And in each of those instances, you're always thinking, well, who is, again, going back to what we were saying, who is my audience here, and how can I maximize the communication and engagement with that audience to get my main points across? In terms of reaching out, the whole importance of that is about re-emphasizing the value of collaboration and the value of collaboration, the value of networking. And you can do this in several easy ways. So you might just, again, it's that email drop, initiate conversations with those individuals who might be interested in your discipline or in your field of research. In some instances, for example, that which I have done in my research, that can include, for example, someone that you've cited somebody in your research, that individual has done a lot of research in this area themselves, perhaps in another context or in another jurisdiction. But you can reach out to them to say, I know you've done this particular piece of, I did recently a piece of research on special educational needs and the assistant, the role of the assistant, the classroom assistant in supporting children with special educational needs. There had been a lot of work done on that in the wider UK, but very little had been done in Northern Ireland. And so by reaching out to the person who had done the research in the wider UK to say, look, we're doing this in a Northern Ireland context because very little has been done about it, you're initiating that conversation and that opportunity to collaborate and to expand your network and your conversation with that person. It's also good, the first one about initiating conversations with those who might be interested. In some cases, that can also then lead to conversations with colleagues from other institutions, other regions who might be interested in collaborating with you to think, well, could we do a transnational study, or could we do a comparative study? So those are always ways of just having an initial conversation to explore the options that might exist around your research, and that can gradually expand over time. We sometimes also forget the importance of, I don't think research takes place in a vacuum. It's very seldom that any of us undertake research on a purely solo basis. The importance of collaborating with others, it automatically widens your circle, that circle of reach, whether that's within your own discipline or whether it's as an interdisciplinary team member, because quite often you find that some disciplines are natural partners for your work. So, for example, within the School of Education, we have a lot of interdisciplinary relationships with the School of Psychology, with nursing, with computing science, with geography, because people are doing maybe slightly different, but still have an overlap. There's an alignment perhaps with some of the research lenses that they're working with that makes you natural collaborators, not for every study, but for some studies. And that automatically is just really capitalizing on the very, very rich opportunities that collaboration with others can bring. And I know from my own personal experience that I have learned so much more from collaborating with others, particularly interdisciplinary collaboration, because it expands your thinking, it expands the perspective perhaps that you take on things, your knowledge base, the reference points that you start your research from. It automatically expands your networks. And it just introduces you also, which is hugely important for our own empirical research, is it exposes you perhaps to alternative methodologies or alternative approaches to research design that you might not have considered if you had just been within your own disciplinary field. And again, I think it's something that can't be underestimated. So I've talked about research and impact most of the way along the presentation. But I think the reach that you can get in your research is very much synonymous with impact, because if you create a reach in your research, it can't not have some kind of impact. And I would say both are integral to the conduct of your research. Now, I'm giving you a definition of impact within a UK setting. Within the United Kingdom, there is a research excellence framework that's called REF. You'll see in the middle icon, and it's where all universities in the UK submit examples of their research every 5, 6 years, and it's assessed for the quality of the research and the impact of the research. But again, just it's a good working definition that I think applies to anyone anywhere doing research. That impact should show an effect on, a change or a benefit to whether that's to the economy, society, culture, public policy or services, health, the environment or quality of life, and importantly, beyond academia. So it doesn't stay in this narrow bubble of academia. It has academic value, but it then has that transferable impact and value for the benefit or the change to that list that has been given. And a way of kind of asking ourselves, well, how can we gauge how impactful or research is by undertaking a kind of an impact assessment. And that can be done internally. You can set up your own benchmark measures, if you like, for assessing impact. So you would think, well, how does my impact score in terms of its rigor? So what is the quality of the research in terms of perhaps my research design, my research methodology, how my data was collected? How is my impact score in relation to its significance? So in that regard, it's to what extent or to what degree did my research change or benefit someone or something, or certainly contribute to understandings in a particular thing? And how did to what extent did the reach of my research have impact? So in other words, what extent or who were the diversity of beneficiaries who benefited from my research? So research and impact, as I say, would be fairly synonymous with one another. In terms of impact also, I think it's important to recognise that as an integral part of developing your research, because particularly if you're thinking about applying for research funding, whether that's nationally or internationally, and whether it's explicit or implicit in funding guidelines, there is definitely an increasing expectation that researchers, as part of their development, should demonstrate what the potential impact of their research might be. So they've already thought about that's again part of that pre-planning. Who is potentially going to benefit from this research, or what impact could it have? It's a good idea to be thinking about impact just in terms of your own career prospects. So for example, demonstration perhaps of how your research has achieved or certainly made a contribution to impact can sometimes become a factor in researcher recruitment or career advancement, where you might be asked to provide evidence for how you have perhaps achieved a degree of impact, whether short or longer term, in your research. A lot of research funders now increasingly have impact as a core consideration as part of that grant application process. If you're applying for external funding, so impact, you would be asked to consider what is the potential impact and how are you going to achieve that, whether that's in the short or the longer term. And then also there is that personal fulfillment of of the impact that your research has achieved on a very human, individual, social, cultural level to say, I didn't just do my research, complete a report and put it in a cupboard. It's the motivation that we can have as researchers to kind of almost altruistically generate impact, that we want our research to matter and we want it to have to make a contribution and to make a difference, and contribute to that wider public good. So there's that altruistic element of it as well, and each of those again have a role and a contribution in terms of developing your research. So just before we finish off, I'm not sure, Helena, what way the sessions finish is, whether people have any observations or any comments they might want to make, or if anyone would like to share thoughts in terms of how they might think, well, I never thought of that, how they could develop reach and impact in their own research, things that maybe they're already doing, or things that they think perhaps I could do more of something else, or I could add something else into my reach activities.